Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jennifer Adams. I'm Editor-in-Chief with Signature Leadership by Knowledge Hook, and thrilled to have you here at our webinar. The topic today is the OECD Survey on Social Emotional Skills, finding from the second cycle. Those of you that have been with us for a while know that we did some great sessions after the first cycle of the survey on social emotional skills. And we're really excited to have our colleagues from the OECD to come and present the findings from that cycle. We have three partners that typically host the SEL Global Leadership Series. The first is Signature Leadership by Knowledge Hook. Knowledge Hook is a digital math company out of Canada that's doing great work with helping teachers be better prepared to interact and have great teaching and learning happening in mathematics. Our second partner is Karanga, and Karanga is a global alliance for SEL and life skills. It is a group of approximately 150 individuals and organizations that are really committed to seeing what's happening with social emotional learning and sharing best practices from right around the world. Our third partner is Salzburg Global Seminar, and it's an international nonprofit that came into being just after the Second World War, really with the concept of helping to prepare current and future leaders to shape a better world, and we certainly continue to need that kind of support. And we're thrilled to be partnering with the OECD for this webinar. The OECD has done incredible work in the area of education, of course, and particularly in the area of social emotional learning. So thank you to all the partners. We're super excited to say that we've got registrants from 5 Canadian provinces and territories, from 12 states across the US, and from 35 different countries. So we're really looking forward to a great conversation, and invite you to jump in on the chat and say hello, and we'll bring in some questions. I'm going to very quickly introduce our two colleagues from the OECD. We've got Noémie Le Donné and Gemma Coleman, and they will be sharing the findings. And Stephanie Jones, some of you may know the incredible work that she's doing out of the EASL Lab at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Stephanie is a great example of someone, when you attend one of these and you interact a lot, we'll come and knock on your door and beg you to come and be a panelist. So Stephanie and Noémie and Gemma, we're thrilled to have you here. I'm going to hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Dominic Regester from Salzburg Global Seminar, and we will dive in.
Thanks, Jen, and hello, everybody. Welcome to what I think is the 26th installment of the SEL Leadership Series. Now, fantastic that Noémie is back for a second consecutive appearance. Thank you very much for coming back. And Gemma and Stephanie are both making their debuts in the series as presenters. The way we're going to structure the time together is Gemma is going to take us through a presentation divided in two parts. The first part looking at the relationship between social emotional skills and student life outcomes. And that'll take about 5–10 minutes. We'll then have a pause. Stephanie will give some reflections on that, and we'll open it up for a bit of any quick questions or urgent issues that have come up in the chat relating to what Gemma has said. Gemma will then give the second half of her presentation, which will focus on disparities in skill levels by student characteristics and some of the differences between the 2019 report and the 2023 report. And then again, Stephanie will give some reflections, play the role of respondent, and we'll open it up for discussion with anyone who wants to contribute via the chat, and obviously with Noémie and Gemma and Stephanie and Jen. So without further ado, Gemma, thank you very much for putting the presentation together, and really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Dominic. So hi, everyone that's joining online. It's great to be here to share insights from our latest report from the survey on social emotional skills. So I'm just going to start out by giving some brief background on the survey for those that are not familiar with it. So the latest round of the survey took place last year in 2023, and it's the first system-level survey of social emotional skills. So what skills do we measure? So we look at a broad range of skills that are organized into 5 overarching domains. So these include collaboration skills, skills that relate to engaging with others, emotional regulation skills, open-mindedness, and task performance skills. So you can see those there on the right. So our latest report, which was published last month, is titled Social Emotional Skills for Better Lives. So this report looks at how these skills relate to students' life outcomes and their future aspirations, and how these skills are distributed among different student groups. So who participated in the survey? So we have a broad range of sites that participated in the first and second rounds. So we want to say a big thank you to all of the students that participated, as well as their teachers and school leaders, and everyone that worked really hard to deliver the survey, which enables us to have the data that we're sharing today. So let's get into the results. So first of all, let's see how the different social emotional skills relate to students' educational outcomes. So here we're looking at the relationship between these skills and grades. So what we see is that students with greater social emotional skills tend to achieve better grades, and we see those relationships here in maths, but also in reading and in arts. So we see that there are some skills that are more strongly related to these subjects than others, but actually across the subjects, with a few exceptions, the relationships are also quite similar. So let's look more closely at the skills with the strongest relationships with grades. So these are skills that we refer to as task performance skills. So these are achievement motivation, persistence, responsibility and self-control, and also curiosity. So what we see is that these skills are linked to better grades among all the student groups that we assessed during the survey. So we look at both 15-year-olds and 10-year-olds. And also, if we look at socioeconomic background, we see these relationships both for advantaged students, but also for disadvantaged students, and also for girls and boys. So these 5 skills are related to grades in a similar way for these different student groups. And then if we look across the range of participating sites, we find, again, that these skills are associated with better grades for students in all of the sites that we looked at during the survey. So in some sites, these relationships are stronger than others, although we find these relationships in all of the sites. And this might mean that in some sites, this might reflect differences in teaching, but also in the way these subjects are assessed. So what we're doing in the survey is we're collecting the grades that students themselves actually receive from their teachers and after they've taken tests and so on. So some of the differences we see in the relationships might reflect the implicit or explicit assessment of these skills as part of the assessment of those subjects. So as well as educational outcomes, we also look at students' health and well-being outcomes. So what we find is that emotional regulation skills, energy and trust, students with greater levels of those skills tend to be happier and healthier. So students with greater levels of these skills report healthier behaviours. So these are behaviours such as getting more sleep, more nights, and eating more fruits and vegetables. And also these students report greater psychological well-being, and they're less anxious when they're taking tests, but also during class at school. But it's not just these skills. So these skills have the strongest relationships, but we also see these relationships with other skills, including those from the task performance domain, which we discussed earlier, and open-mindedness skills. So those are creativity and curiosity, for example. So again, the higher students' levels of these skills, the healthier their behaviours, the greater their psychological well-being, and the lower anxiety they report during tests and in class. So we also ask students what they expect to do in the future in terms of their education, but also their career aspirations. So broadly, what we find is that most students expect to complete tertiary education. So just over 4 in 5 students across the sites on average expect to complete tertiary education in the future. And also a high proportion of students, so just over half, expect to have a managerial or professional career in the future. So there are high levels of expectations of these outcomes among students. And what we find is that students with higher open-mindedness skills, task performance skills, but also empathy, tend to have higher expectations of these outcomes in the future. And this is important because when students are applying for higher education, when students are applying for jobs, often these are the sorts of skills that are being assessed in those processes. So it's not just students' academic skills that are being assessed. During interviews and other forms of assessments, employers and institutions are often assessing these skills as well. And then we also asked students specifically about what type of job they wanted to have in the future. And what we find is that students' career aspirations often align with their skills. So students who expect to have a career in science report high levels of curiosity and creativity. And students that expect to have a career in health, they also report high levels of curiosity, but also persistence and responsibility and empathy. And then we also ask a student how likely they think it is that they'll start a business when they're older. And these students are more likely to have high levels of optimism, but also creativity and skills that relate to engaging with others, like assertiveness and energy. So what we see here is that we think that students, as they think about their future career aspirations, they're reflecting on their strengths and they're identifying career paths that fit with their strengths. But what's important is to make sure that students obviously are able to identify their strengths. And sometimes, students from different, as we see later on, different backgrounds and different characteristics might underestimate their skills sometimes. But it's also important that students know the sorts of skills that are needed in different jobs in order for them to make this assessment of the fit between their own skills and the career that they're looking to do in the future. So we'll pause there for some discussion. Thanks, Dominic.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gemma. There's so much to process and make sense of. Stephanie, would you like to comment first?
I mean, of course, I love this. So this is the second time I've heard a report of these findings, and each time I think about a whole variety of different things. And this time, I just first wanted to commend the OECD and this group in particular for doing this work. It is so important. And I think, as was said in the launch, the whole process of making what has been over time, or what tends to be invisible, visible, is really important to everything we can do to support young people today, wherever we are. And so thank you for doing this work. I think it's hugely important. Here's what I'm thinking today about these findings. Clearly, this array of social and emotional skills are related to things that we value and are important for young people to succeed around the world. What's really interesting, and what I noticed anew this time, is that it is clear there are subsets of skills that are more strongly related to different outcome domains. And then there are a set of common skills that seem to be associated across outcome domains. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that I noticed, which is that curiosity, persistence, responsibility, self-control, and achievement motivation represent sort of a cluster of skills that are related to academic outcomes. I know this is rough, so it's not perfectly the case, but it is generally the case. So that's one cluster of skills. The other cluster of skills are optimism, energy, stress resistance, emotional control, and trust that are related to those kind of health and psychological outcomes. So that's a different cluster of skills. And then there's a subset that seem like they're associated, actually it's kind of across all of them, that are associated with expectations around tertiary education. Across those three outcome domains, there is a common set. It's smaller, and it includes curiosity, persistence, responsibility, and self-control. And what that tells me is that there is a roadmap. Like, these data give us a roadmap to possible practices, strategies, and responses that we can embed in our practical work in school. So we might think about, what are the strategies and practices that are really closely tied to the cluster of skills that are linked to academic outcomes? What are the strategies and practices that are really closely tied to the cluster of skills that are tied to those health outcomes? And then how can we double down on the subset that are common to all of them? Like, we really should be spending some time there. So just again, these data are so helpful because they reveal these patterns to us, and they give us some information about where we should focus our efforts. So thank you.
Yes.
It's so great.
Just to follow up, thank you, Stephanie, for your first set of comments and for acknowledging the work You are also doing amazing work. So we are also a big admirer of your work. Just to say that in parallel to this work, we also did some research on, we looked at the evaluation of interventions. And we also found that, I mean, and you know this literature very well, that these skills are also highly teachable. So this gives us a lot of hope. I would also want to stress that evidence from longitudinal data, which is sometimes more, small scale because they cover like only one territory while we cover a lot, also highlights that these skills can be developed over time and that they are related to the different outcomes that you mentioned. So it's very interesting to have all these different data sources with their own strengths and weaknesses. Here we are clearly strong in terms of geographical coverage, but we are looking at correlational data. But when we look at also the, causal relationships that could be identified by, smaller scale research, we also find like some convergence. And I think this is really reassuring, and it goes in the direction that you pointed us to. So very complementary research there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Noémie, when you were with us in April, then you were talking about the report on the teachability of these skills. So all of the skills that Gemma has been talking about are teachable, aren't they? They're not things that some of them aren't innate and some people are not in others. They're all teachable.
Yes, I think most of the skills we looked at, we found we reviewed recent evidence of the teachability, and for many of them, we found research showing evidence that they are teachable or highly teachable. So for some skills, we find like a lot of evidence. And I must say that for a couple of skills, we didn't find any study. So there is also like a research gap here to fill in, because we don't know if they can be taught. Perhaps just to give you a couple of examples, we found that skills such as self-control, self-efficacy, cooperation, empathy, assertiveness, etc., can be taught. Of course, creativity and curiosity as well. But I think for some of the skills such as optimism, trust, we found more limited evidence because there is not enough studies on those skills. So just to flag that. It doesn't mean that they cannot be taught, it's just that we don't know.
Yeah. I just want to make one comment about that, which is that there's, just as Noémie described, there's lots of evidence that these skills can be taught, or, there's explicit evidence for many of them, and maybe we don't have quite the evidence available yet for some others. I think it's important to think about both skills in individuals that can be supported and fostered, that grow and develop and change over time, and the ways that places, settings, features of learning environments, conditions are also really important in fostering skills among students. And one mental exercise I was doing myself in thinking about this report and the findings was to remind myself that these are correlational data, and that we might even say, let's imagine flipped associations, right? Let's imagine that students are imagining their future and have an aspiration for tertiary education. What are the characteristics of students who have that aspiration? And what does that tell us? What do those flipped, like if we imagine these all flipped, what does that tell us about conditions and opportunities and settings that we want to put in place in addition to any practice or strategy or teaching we might do about individual skills? Those two are really important to always think about together.
I've got a great question that has come in from Claire from Luxembourg, and she says she'd love to hear insights on the importance of SEL skills for digital well-being. And some of you in the audience may remember we had a great session on the combination of human skills and AI. And the fact that, you know, with this push towards AI and digital well-being and mental health of our students, etc., how, you know, what's the place for helping to develop these human skills? And would love to hear your comments from the panelists on that.
I can start, but I'm sure Stephanie, feel free to jump in and start.
Oh, okay. So there's some evidence that the kind of cluster of skills that are common to, as I was describing, common to academic outcomes, mental health and well-being, and aspirations for the future are also the kinds of skills that really support young people to manage their digital life in ways that that keep everybody healthy. So it's those kind of basic self-management, self-control, emotion regulation kind of skills that help kids manage their digital life. And there's no surprise that those skills are related to all of these outcomes that might be related to how kids interact with the digital world and online, because they represent a kind of fundamental developmental self-regulation system. But I don't think there's any way we could imagine that there won't be a digital world for kids. And so it's really, what are the tools that we need to give them to be able to engage with it in ways that make sense and are aligned with other things that they need and want to do.
Yeah, so
anybody else?
Just a button. So we didn't have any data as part of this in terms of digital literacy and so on. But as you said, the skills where we're seeing those relationships with healthy behaviors. So for example, like self-control and responsibility, we're just looking here at correlations, but what we discussed in the report is how this is likely a two-way relationship. So the more responsible and more self-control, the easier it is for a student to go to bed on time so they can get the sleep they need and to make healthier choices. But likewise, those behaviors help the development of those skills. So it's discussed a little bit in the report how particularly self-control and so on and responsibility are related to those outcomes and helping students make healthier choices. And it also reminds me that one of the interesting findings in terms of healthier behaviors is that the behavior where we see the most worrying levels is in terms of sleep. And again, you see from lots of studies that in terms of technology, that often that is a barrier to getting enough sleep. And we know from the data that the more sleep students are getting, the higher their well-being outcomes, the greater their psychological well-being, and the better their skills. So supporting students to manage those things, because like you say, Stephanie, they are here to stay, is really important.
Yes, and our plans is to actually collect data on this very topic in the next round of the survey. So the next data collection will be in 2026. And as part of the new themes we would like to introduce, we have responsible, safe use of artificial intelligence, social media, and so on. So I think this is a very valid point where we recognize that we need to collect more data on this. In the second report that we'll publish later this year, we will be analyzing information answers from teachers about the impact of online teaching on students' social emotional skills. So we introduced this question because it was just after COVID. And so the angle was the context was the post-COVID pandemic. But clearly now with the developments, like the domination now of tools like ChatGPT and so on, as well as the development of social media over the last years and decades, it makes it more pressing now to collect additional data on this.
I'm going to ask one more question. We've got a super active group of participants, and one more question that a number have asked. And where can these skills be developed? Is it uniquely in schools, or is it also in home, in community? And some questions around, Stephanie, you kind of dove into that a little bit. What are the conditions, the learning conditions that should be in place? Everything from the teacher-student relationship to the pedagogical practices. Some comments from Stephanie, and then maybe Gemma and Noémie, some evidence from what you've seen in the OECD studies.
So I'll start and be brief, which is to say that the set of social and emotional skills described here and those that appear in all the frameworks that kind of define this big domain, they are rooted. They have their core in high quality interactions and relationships. And so there's a great deal of evidence, certainly from programs implemented in schools that have studies of them, that these skills can be fostered and taught in schools. But of course, they are absolutely fostered and cultivated inside high quality relationships between children and adults at home, in the community. So they really are inside of all interactions. And we could imagine fostering them with direct strategies and supports in all kinds of different settings. And there are, in fact, example programs that operate in all kinds of settings, in school, out of school, with parents, in community settings of many types, in sports, and so on. So really everywhere. And I'll just say one thing about the kind of conditions. So in our review of what's common in effective approaches to building social and emotional skills, we really find that it's about a couple of things. One is ensuring that environments are experienced by children and youth as safe and as a place where they are noticed and feel that they belong. So you can think about the ways that we might ensure that learning environments are understood or experienced by young people as safe and one where they are noticed and belong. And then the other side of the story is that there's direct teaching about social and emotional skills in the setting. So I'll turn it to my other colleagues. Of course, I could talk about this forever, so I will exert self-regulation on myself.
We have data from the first data collection that took place in 2019, and we looked at the relationship between participation in extracurricular activity and some of the social and emotional skills. Actually, we focused on creativity and curiosity, and we found that there is a positive correlation here. So students who tend to participate more in these extracurricular activities also tend to report higher levels of creativity and curiosity, which suggests that it could be a double, of course, relationship with students who are more creative, more curious, going to sign up more often to these activities, but also a positive effect of attending these activities on students' social and emotional skills. We also have a report looking at teachers' answers. So from 2019 again, where we found that when teachers team up with parents and share feedback about the children with the parents, then we found that the climate, the school climate, was more positive, and the classroom climate was also more positive. We had better student and teacher relationship, and we also found that this was associated with quality teaching. So this all points to positive effects of collaboration across the board. So teaming up, parents and teachers teaming up to support students' social and emotional skills, and also this points to the fact that social and emotional skills can be developed not only in school, of course, but as Stephanie said, everywhere. There are always opportunities to develop social and emotional skills and put that in practice. So of course.
We
I
have
don't know if Gemma, you have something to add, or maybe we're taking too much time and we need to.
we've got so many good questions. I'm going to go one more, and then we're going to go back to. I know Gemma has more to present from a great colleague, Vicky Shannon, and she's asked the question: is there a notable difference in learning these skills for students in difficult learning circumstances? And I know I had the privilege of sharing, being present at the launch of the findings of the study in Shanghai, and they were very interested in this. The gap, students with lower socioeconomic tended to have lower social emotional skills, and students that were from more privileged positions tended to have higher levels of social emotional skills. And so, you know, what are we doing in systems to try to make sure that we're really helping students that are from those more challenging circumstances to develop those skills? So Noémie and Gemma, a comment on that?
Yeah, so we'll have some slides on that in a moment, but I think it's interesting to think about. So we do see that we see that students from disadvantaged backgrounds report lower levels of skills, and that also fits with the fact that, you know, in more challenging environments, it will be harder to develop these skills. You'll have fewer opportunities. You know, Noémie spoke about extracurricular activities. We know from other research that students from disadvantaged backgrounds have fewer opportunities to do those activities. But I think it's also interesting to think about the possibility that those students might be more likely to underestimate their skills. And we also see that by gender, because we're asking students to evaluate them. And so, for example, one of the, I don't want to spoil what's coming, but one of the skills where we see the biggest difference is in assertiveness. And this is very closely linked to confidence. And again, this is one of the skills that has, as we've seen in other reviews, is strongly linked to job performance and so on. So the answer is yes, and we'll say more about that in the next slides. I think it's a really interesting area to discuss.
Well, Dominic, maybe that's a perfect segue into let's get on to the next piece. So Dominic, back to you.
It's really back to Gemma, I think. Gemma to continue. I say the quality of the chat in this webinar is absolutely superb. And so if you haven't got the chat open, it's well worth looking at and saving at the end, because there's a wealth of great references and really interesting observations and comments. So thank you to everyone who's contributed there. But Gemma, back to you.
Great, thank you. Yes, so moving on then to how levels of social emotional skills differ by students' socioeconomic background. So what we find is that disadvantaged students report lower levels of all the skills that we measure on average, so from all of those different domains that we mentioned. But it's interesting to look at the skills where we see the biggest differences. So in the skills of creativity, tolerance, assertiveness that I mentioned, as well as curiosity, sociability and empathy. So many of these skills are also about relating to others in terms of, you know, sociability, empathy, tolerance. We see these biggest gaps on average across sites. And what we also see with these skills, you know, it's not just the most disadvantaged students. The more disadvantaged the students are according to their background, the bigger the differences we see between those students and the most advantaged. So it's not just a question of the most disadvantaged students, but it's equity across the spectrum of socioeconomic background. We also see that these gaps vary between the sites in terms of the size of the gap between the most advantaged and the most disadvantaged students. So, you know, we see in some sites these differences are much larger, there's much less overlap between the groups. But then on the other end, you know, in Peru, we didn't find any significant difference between the most advantaged and the most disadvantaged students in the skill here of assertiveness. And in other sites, the overlap is very high. And so behind these averages as well, it's important to mention that in all the sites, we found, you know, we see advantaged students who report relatively low levels of skills. We see disadvantaged students who report relatively high levels of skills. So these are not differences that are fixed. And in some sites, you know, the situation is better than in others. So moving on to gender, we see some interesting differences by gender. So overall, we find that girls and boys are evaluating their skills differently. So boys report lower levels, particularly of tolerance and empathy. So we see those differences in most sites. And girls, on average, are reporting lower levels than boys of trust, skills from the emotional regulation domain, so optimism, emotional control, and stress resistance. and energy as well. So those are the skills that are most strongly related to well-being outcomes, where we see girls reporting lower levels. And again, as we saw with socioeconomic background, the size of these differences, gender differences, vary quite a lot between the sites. So I've chosen here the skills with the biggest differences. Stress resistance to the detriment of girls and tolerance to the detriment of boys. And even with these skills, there are some sites where the overlap between these two groups is very high, and in others where there is really a large difference on average between boys and girls. And interestingly then, so we can also look at how levels of student skills have changed since 2019 in two cities that participated in both the first round and the second round. So these are Bogota in Colombia and Helsinki in Finland. So going back to what we were talking about in terms of gender, so those gaps that we see in emotional regulation skills and energy, they were already quite wide in these sites in 2019. But what we saw is that they widened to the detriment of girls in 2023. And then in both these cities, we also saw that levels of most skills, so when we look at all students, on average across all students, dropped between these years. So here we have the difference, the negative difference among 15-year-olds in Bogota, 15-year-olds in Helsinki, 10-year-olds in Bogota, and 10-year-olds in Helsinki. And we see the largest drops in these open-mindedness skills, so creativity, tolerance, curiosity, but also self-control, responsibility, sociability, and trust. So obviously that begs the question, what's happened between these years, and we know what's happened between these years. We've had a pandemic, we've had all sorts of other crises, but I think it's interesting to reflect on why these skills might be those where we see the biggest differences. And again, this is what we're finding in these two cities. We only have data for these two cities, but it's remarkable how consistent they are, despite the very different contexts of the two cities, which again begs the question of whether this is something that happened in many sites, most sites across the world. So yes, ready to discuss the findings more. Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question, Stephanie, before you come in?
Yeah, definitely.
Gemma, with that slide that's up at the moment, do you does that track against other declines in education outcomes over the same period? So if you do a comparison with PISA, for example, does it sort of map? And is it the experience of the pandemic and school closure and disruption and anxiety that has had a sort of consistent impact? Would that be your hypothesis?
Well, I think that's the hypothesis, mainly because of the differences in the context between the sites. So actually, in terms of what they had in common, that's the thing that they most had in common, and also the fact that we see these consistencies between cohorts. These are students in very different life stages, yet we see this consistency. So it is difficult to draw as concrete conclusions as we'd like, because we don't have in this study pre-pandemic, pre-2019 data. As obviously in PISA, there's a lot, the time series is much longer. But we've also, spoken to colleagues in other sites who have done other research projects, and we know this is a finding in other sites. So it's not to say that, that it's likely that it's only in these cities where we're finding it. It seems likely that this is a more widespread occurrence.
Thank you. And I wondered if I could just ask you to say a little bit more about Ukraine in the context. It was surprising in the slides that you showed that Ukraine is not an outlier, given everything, in addition to everything else that all the students in the survey are experiencing. Obviously, students in Ukraine are dealing with all manner of other potential traumatic events, but Ukraine is actually sort of fairly consistent within the data, isn't it?
Yes, that's fair. But I think also, we're not measuring levels of skills. So we're looking at relationships and we're looking at differences by student characteristics. So you wouldn't necessarily expect, I think, the situation in Ukraine to result in differences in those relationships. But yeah, it's the case that we see similarities. There are some exceptions. I mean, they're quite niche. I remember that in terms of the age differences, there were smaller age differences in Ukraine compared to other sites. And one of the hypotheses there is that actually, rather than that being a positive thing, that actually, we haven't discussed it here, but we often see declines in students' evaluations of their skills between 10 and 15. What we think might be happening in Ukraine is, particularly because of the exposure there to all manner of adult things that people wouldn't necessarily experience or be aware of until they're much older, that actually that drop might have happened a bit earlier. But again, these are hypotheses. We don't have data from even younger students in Ukraine. But when you look at that data and the consistency across the skills and so on, you start to form hypotheses like that.
Thank you, Gemma. Stephanie, please.
I want to start with this, but I'm just going to say two other things about the patterns by subgroups. I mean, the findings about the pattern of differences between quote disadvantaged and advantaged groups and between boys and girls are somewhat familiar. So there's lots of there's many studies over the last 20 or 30 or 50 years that describe the impact of socioeconomic adversity, exposure to trauma and stress, to vulnerability, sort of more generally, and this whole body of skills showing that children who face those kinds of stressors tend to do worse. I'll just keep beating a particular drum, which is that we also know that strategic, focused, high-quality interventions that hark from the big domain of social and emotional learning do make a difference in offsetting those relationships, in interrupting the cycle of exposure to stress and these kinds of negative outcomes. So there's lots we can do, and that is really important to remember. The brain is plastic, behavior is plastic, well into adulthood. And so it tells us that we want to blend kind of universal approaches with targeted approaches that are oriented toward particular groups or maybe particular outcomes that are particularly sensitive to exposure to stress, vulnerability, adversity. The gender findings surprised me. I'll just say that out loud. They surprised me. They didn't surprise me at first. And then when I looked at the specific outcomes that varied between boys and girls, some of them did surprise me. They were not consistent with some of the information we have, maybe focused on slightly younger kids, but I was surprised to see that girls were lower than boys on average in things like emotional control and stress resistance. That's something that we haven't seen. We've seen the opposite in other literature. And so again, it's just kind of making the invisible visible, again, gives us a roadmap to think about the kinds of things that we might focus on as a set of supports. To the changes over time. And I will only say a couple of things about this. Certainly, we know from, I think, Gemma, you just said this, from lots of other data that these skills in terms of how kids view themselves and adults report them tend to degrade over age, right? Degrade maybe isn't a good word, but they go down. And that's not necessarily a new thing. So these data are actually really confirming many patterns and trends that we've seen before from isolated and not connected studies. The pandemic effects, I think, are really important to take seriously. I read those declines less about age and more about pandemic. And maybe that's because I'm worried about the fact that there hasn't been enough talk about the impact of the pandemic on social and emotional skills. So certainly in the US and maybe in other places, we are worried about academic gaps. They are on the radio, in the news all the time. And there's lots of evidence from our data, from others' data in the US and other places that there are, with longitudinal data, many measurements before the pandemic, many measurements since, that there are pretty robust declines in children's self-control, self-regulation, so high levels of dysregulation, externalizing and aggressive behavior, and direct assessments of executive function. And so I think we should focus on these patterns and shift a conversation to how do we support children's social and emotional well-being as a pathway to closing those gaps that we talk about in the academic domain. And so I just want to put a particular emphasis on those findings. I know we can't describe them as causal, but there are other pieces of evidence that get closer to that I think complement these patterns. And it's really important. It's really important. So I'll stop talking about that now and turn it back to you.
Thank you. If I may jump in and follow up regarding the how the skills and the gender gaps change over time. We also have a study which surveyed 5-year-old children, and they found that actually girls outperform boys in many different domains. So what you have observed and the appearance inconsistency might have to do actually with what you said, like we are looking at different gender, age cohorts, so that can explain the pattern. So it seems that girls like start very strong, and then the boys catch up, and even like develop at the expense of girls when we reach the age of 15. And then it's also interesting to say that we also have data on adults, like through the at the OECD through the PIAC data set. We also collect information on adult social emotional skills. There will be also a report at the end of this year. So now we can also, through cross-sectional data, of course, we have different data points at the OECD where we can also look at the gender gaps over the life course. So I just wanted to follow up on that. Regarding the decline in social emotional skills that we found in Helsinki and Bogota, interestingly, of course, we talked with our colleagues in Helsinki, and they explained, and they also mentioned that during the global launch that we had at the end of April, that they also have national data where they could compare Helsinki with the rest of the country, and they could see that actually for other measures but related to social emotional skills, they found that Helsinki was capable of containing the decline compared to the other cities. So it's interesting to see that perhaps this decline that we see in Helsinki and Bogota is also quite a pioneer in Colombia in terms of social emotional learning, promoting this. There are 2 leading examples in their countries. They still have this decline. So it means that even though they put in place programs, social emotional learning programs, like they try to support schools as best as they can, and they had more resources probably than other cities in their country, they still saw this decline. So this is quite worrying. I think this is like, just to put it in other words, I think it's probably the lower bounds that we are measuring.
Yes, I agree, 100%.
So I completely second you in terms of, yes, we need to focus our attention on that and be very careful about the effect of the pandemic in particular, and the very tense global context, political context at this time.
Noémie, just a quick jump in. You're talking about that decline in the social emotional skills, and certainly, if we were talking to teachers, they would describe how they're seeing an overall decline in well-being, and we know that there's a correlation between social emotional skills and well-being. So probably not that much is surprising. On the gender piece, and I just want clarification on this. I believe that it's self-report by the students. And I'm wondering if there's an element of that as well, that I'm going to say the girls are harder on themselves. They're saying that they don't have as much trust, they don't have as much optimism, etc. If there's a piece in that. And part of the reason why I bring this up is I know that the OECD is looking at a whole R&D focus on different ways of measuring these skills. So just a comment on that before I hand it back to Dominic.
Gemma, do you want to say something about the self-perception?
Yeah, so it's something we discuss in the report a bit, because it seems a very strong possibility. And also it's particularly interesting when you look at other outcomes. So we know from PISA that girls often achieve, better academic outcomes. We see in our own data that girls have higher expectations of things like completing tertiary, of having managerial careers. So in that sense, they're very ambitious and their outcomes are very positive. Boys are also more likely to be late for school, skip school, all of these things. So it feels sometimes like a slight contradiction then that you see that, I highlighted those with the biggest differences, but we also see girls on average reporting lower levels of other skills that don't really seem to align with what we see in terms of their actual achievement and their actual outcomes. And so, yes, that hypothesis seems very possible from the data and being self-reports, even though obviously the questions are worded in a way to try and reduce those biases as much as possible. We are asking students to evaluate their own abilities, and that's why it's important that this is recognized when you're working with students. Are you telling them, are you giving them information about their strengths to counter these negative self-beliefs, so that they can evaluate their own strengths properly?
So yeah, just to comment that also in the first round of the data collection, so the data that was collected in 2019, students also had to take like vignettes. So we use them to anchor the reference that the student was using. And when we corrected for that, that bias that we were trying to capture through this anchoring vignettes, we didn't find like very, very important differences. So at least across countries, we need to look at the findings like across gender. I don't remember them off the top of my head, so we need to look into this. But I remember the main conclusion of that, robustness check exercise was to say it doesn't change much. Yes, we are trying to measure the skills more directly in the next round of the survey. Also to try to mitigate this bias that we can have with self-report. So we plan to introduce situational judgment tests, so where we will be presenting students with scenarios, and they will have to tell us in their view what would be an appropriate answer behavior in that situation. So the scenario would not describe, would not like put themselves as part of the scenario. It will be something like more external to them, so that it can be considered like really direct assessment and not like again a self-report. And we also plan to introduce task-based assessments. There is a skill that we mentioned several times already during this meeting, which is self-control, which can be pretty well assessed through direct assessments, where we present again the student with a task like with a low cognitive load, so it's easy. You don't need to have like high cognitive abilities to take the test. And we introduce distractors, and we see if the student is able to focus on the task while being distracted by different things. And this can be done in a short period of time, so that we don't, add too much like survey burden on students. We don't take too much of their time, but at the same time, it will give us like a good proxy for self-control and more direct assessment. And this will be particularly interesting indeed to check if we have the same gender differences in that case, and also to have more direct comparisons also across countries. So it's going to be very, very helpful. Thank you for your question, Jen.
Wonderful.
There was a really great question from Anya Chakraborty in the chat about urban-rural distinctions. And I wondered, with where you've had whole countries involved in the survey, have you got to a level of analysis yet where you can look at urban and rural trends or differences within them? Or is that an aspect for future research, do you think?
Yeah, so it's something we're planning to look at for the second report if we have the numbers, but obviously we have some countries where we can do that. Yes, I've seen some of the data, but we haven't published it yet, so I'll keep Sturm on what that shows. But yes, that is something we know people are interested in for sure.
Can I just say something about the direct assessments? There are lots of, not lots, but there are some, Noémie was just referring to some of them, direct assessments, performance-based tasks that capture things like executive function and self-regulation, and those have been developed and used in lots of places around the world, and they are really useful for these kinds of studies if we can have the resources to embed them into our data collection. The thing to always wonder about is whether or not those assessments are good characterizations of what we would expect to see in behavior in the real world when all the other things are happening. So is a measure of self-control or executive function really going to reflect what children do when all the things are happening and it is emotionally tense and lots of things are going on? So while those types of assessments are really important and give us a window into children's skills, that window approximates only so much of the truth, just as the self-report does, just as a teacher report does. So ideally, what we're doing is that we have all the resources in the world, and we are getting views of children's skills and behavior from a performance-based task, from student self-report, and from the adults who know them well. And there are ways to sample that would allow us to gather those 3 views or 4 views on a subsample, right? To give us some sense of how we're doing when we only have one or the other view. So we have to think creatively about these things, but also realistically about what they really tell us. So just a caution.
Thank you. We're almost at time, I think, which is a great shame. And the hour has flown by, and we could have done with several more hours. I said before, I'd like to just remind everyone, if you have the chance to save the chat, it is well worth saving because there's a library's worth of references and great reading within there. Jenny, you're going to see us home. There's a couple more slides to show on.
Absolutely. We will wrap things up, and want to be able to point out, my colleague Ryan will share his screen. And this was a session that we did about a month ago. And all of you on the line, you're all part of now knowledgehook.com/leadership. And if you look on that portal and look up onto, click onto the tab with roundtables, you'll see there's a whole series of the SEL Global Leadership Series. And this is one based on the comments that were in the chat that I think that you would find really helpful with Noémie and Adriano and Dominic. I'm also going to pass it over to Noémie to say that the good news is that they have an amazing new report coming up. And we also have a willingness from this team to come back and do another session. So Noémie, over to you. Maybe Ryan, if you can go back to the previous slide.
Yeah, well, I think you said it all, and for the sake of time, I think you can move to the next one. But yes, basically we'll cover, we'll report on teachers and principals' answers and describe to what extent teachers and schools are ready for social emotional learning in the different jurisdictions where we implemented the survey. I also wanted to flag that we are inviting countries, cities to join the 3rd round of the survey. If you're interested, please reach out to me, and you also have the contact email from the team. And as you can see, there is, in terms of the innovation we plan to introduce, there is a theme that was discussed today: responsible and safe use of AI and social media. So do not hesitate to contact us.
There's a question. My understanding is when the report will be released, and I think that it's generally the fall of next year. Noémie, is that accurate?
Yes, probably end of October 2024, to be confirmed.
And we will make sure that we have another one of these sessions. I want to thank Stephanie, Noémie, Gemma, and Dominic. An amazing conversation. And as Dominic said, huge kudos to the chat. So many good questions and comments and sharing of information. And yeah, that's what this is all about. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed this. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know your thoughts and desires for future sessions. Thanks so much. Have a great day, and we hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.